first part, I did a little side. In the first part, I did a little side-by-side comparison of the four resurrection stories in the four Gospels. And in the second part of the video, I focused mostly on Luke's Gospel and gave it short shrift in some ways, knowing that we'd have a chance to discuss it more here. So do you have any questions about the comparison or about Luke's Gospel itself? Let me ask you, have you ever done, either formally or informally, a side-by-side comparison of the resurrection stories before? And it's interesting, isn't it? The most surprising of which is always Mark's, because it ends so abruptly and difficult. It's a difficult end. For those of you that haven't seen the video yet, in Mark's Gospel, the women go to the tomb, and there's a young man there dressed in white who tells them he is risen. Go tell Peter and the others that he will meet you in Galilee, like he said. In the last verse, verse 8 says, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And the story ends. Now, did the story intend to end is a real good question. It could be that some of the earliest manuscripts of Mark's Gospel were simply incomplete. But the earliest manuscripts that we have end with verse 8. And you can tell the age of manuscripts because of the writing, the type of papyri that are used for script and so forth. It's not until later, probably the early part of the 2nd century, that the Gospel of Mark is lengthened. Sometimes with about 3 more verses, sometimes with quite a few more verses. And it feels like with such an abrupt, inconclusive ending, as they were afraid and said nothing to anyone, that a lot of people feel compelled to complete it. It's a marveling sort of thing. I also feel like when you read the end of Matthew's Gospel, it looks like Matthew is one of those people who's completing the story. Because the women are afraid, but they tell anyway. In Luke's Gospel, the women go back and tell, and the men don't believe them.
That sounds like it should come from.
Yeah, it does. Only Luke's very sympathetic to women throughout his Gospel.
No, I'm talking about the apostles' reaction.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. In Mark's Gospel, the apostles, disciples, apostles, followers, the 12 throughout the Gospel are notoriously stupid, right? They don't understand. They don't have it yet believed. They don't get it. But when you get to the resurrection story, almost all of the Gospels have something of that nature in there. So when you do that side by side, and especially when you deal with Mark's troubling ending, that's why Werner Kelber argues that in Mark's view, the disciples fail. That the church, the followers of Christ, was supposed to be based in Galilee, a communitarian grassroots movement in Galilee, and that the apostles, as it were, ended up camping out in Jerusalem and making that their base camp, contrary to the words of Jesus, and that therefore they failed. And Mark's Gospel seems to be written to a kind of thread of Galilean piety, that this is the direction of Christianity. It's a pretty interesting argument, and we don't know. We can't go behind the text and see if Mark had his eyebrows furrowed as he was writing this chapter, or if he wrote more and it's just a corrupted text and we don't have the rest of it. We just don't know. That's part of the peril of only having what texts were preserved in whatever state they were preserved, and then working from there. So that side by side is really interesting, I think. And again, any questions about the comparison of the 4 resurrection stories? All right. What I did try to throw out to you in the video was 3 questions. Who went to the tomb? And who's the one person in all 4 stories that goes to the tomb?
Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene. That's right. So the next time we name a room at this church, I think we need to reach back and find the original witness to the good news of the resurrection, right? Mary Magdalene. All right. What did they find in the tomb?
Nobody.
Nobody, right? But somebody. Nobody. But from there it changes, right? In Mark's gospel, you've got a man in white robe. In Luke, and in somewhere else, 2 men in dazzling apparel. In one, there's an angel sitting on the rock. That's my favorite. Yeah, so kind of a difference of answers there. The point being, however, that there's not a body in there, which is what they went to find. That's the whole point, right? And then how did they react? It's interesting. There are moments of doubt and disbelief throughout all these stories. And you might feel like, well, someone rising from the dead, that's pretty obvious that this is a miracle, and so forth. In Matthew's gospel, I think, wait a minute. In Matthew's gospel, it ends with what we call the Great Commission, right? Jesus saying, go into all the world and preach the gospel, yada, yada. Read that whole section, not just verses 19 to 28, which is what people typically read. Because they meet Jesus on the mountain, and it says, and some doubted. And some doubted. There's a resurrected Jesus right there, and some doubted. Explain that to me. And the word some, which makes it sound like maybe 1 or 2 out of the group doubted. The word some is an interpretation. It literally means they met Jesus there and they doubted. There's no sum to it. The subject of that verb, doubted, is implied in the verb because it's in the 3rd person plural. Just like the word met is the 3rd person plural. So if you're going to say they met, you should probably consistently say they doubted. But biblical translators just can't bring themselves to do that, right? It is possible to say some, but that's not what Matthew says. They met Jesus there and they doubted. And there's a resurrected Christ right in front of them. So we think on occasion that that this is all a slam dunk if you were there, if you saw the miracle, if you saw this, saw that. But the way the stories are told, it's not a slam dunk, even if you are there. Even if you're looking into an empty tomb, it's not a slam dunk. Even if you're standing there on a mountain with the risen Christ, it's not a slam dunk. There's still room for doubt. And I think part of the genius of the biblical stories is all of the arguments that I have heard over the years from either people in a genuine place of disbelief or skeptics who are just trying to take pot shots at religious faith. They've all been anticipated in these stories. They're full of doubt. It's hard to believe that the account of eyewitnesses. You can have women that you know perfectly well are not liars walk into the room and say the tomb is empty, and a bunch of guys go, maybe not, Maybe you're just being hysterical. The scriptures are just full of these moments when simplicity is out the window from the very beginning. It's always complex. And any of the complexities what we raise today, I think most of them, maybe there are some unique ones, but almost all the complexities that we raise today have already been entertained in the story when you read them close. Yeah, and so resurrection doesn't, at no point in the story is resurrection proof positive that convinces everybody. It always remains a thing for which one must believe, trust. And that's what really strikes me when I read them side by side. And again, I want to say the early church entrusted us with different accounts as a way of honoring that there are many ways of telling the truth. It doesn't have to be one rigid way of doing it. I think that's really powerful, but I'm a believer. If you're on the outside looking in, you could hear everything I just said and said, yeah. You just say that to make yourself feel good. So I just profess from the very start as a believer. That's how it strikes me. And I think it's complex. I think it's sophisticated. And I think it's very authentic. Nothing about this is superficial or simple. Okay, let's look at Luke then, just Luke, for a minute. And I want to look at the women. Who are these women? If you circle back just a few verses to the end of chapter 23, starting with verse 55, it says, the women who had come with him from Galilee. Okay, so these are Galilean women. They followed, and they saw the tomb where his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointment. On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment. Okay, so you got the women kind of scoping out where to go, making plans, and then they make preparation, and then they rest. Day 1, day 2, and then day 3 is when they go with those preparations, those ointments that they put together, ready to do something with this body. They're not named until later in our story, but they are named in our story in verse 10. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women. So whatever other Marys or whoever else you feel like belong in the group, they're thrown in there. And their response, I want to look at 3 things that they did in response to this empty tomb in the conversation with the men in dazzling clothes. First of all, they're perplexed. That's an interesting term. I studied up on it a little bit. It's very rare in the New Testament. This is Luke's only use of the term that's translated perplexed. It's actually in the infinitive mood. So a verb in the infinitive mood, we typically translate like to run or to be perplexed, something, or to perplex, something like that. It's an odd, it's in the middle voice, so it would be passive. And it's something like they became in perplexity over this. It's a very, if you try to translate it literally, it becomes really, really awkward. I think but I think whenever Luke does that, because Luke has excellent Greek, best Greek of all the 4 Gospels, I think. When Luke has something like they became in perplexity or in a state of perplexity, something, when he has a very awkward phrase like that, I think what it does is adds depth to it. That this was I think this was a way of expressing that this was not a momentary thought. Wonder why the tomb is empty. you know, but a lingering thing. So my suggestion for you when reading Luke's story is give it time. Give it time. They get there. First thing they see is nothing. And they are perplexed. One can imagine all the things running through their heads. The body was stolen. They moved him because they hate him. All these kinds of things. We don't have anything in Luke's gospel about Roman soldiers guarding the tomb. That's all in a different gospel. But we do have this perplexity. It's not something we see very often. And then again, the term dazzling apparel, these two men in dazzling apparel, that too is a relatively rare term in Luke's gospel. It's used twice. And the first time is from chapter 17, when Jesus makes reference to lightning lighting up the sky, dazzling up the sky. So that's a good image, I think, to have in your head. Whether it's heat lightning that just suddenly enlightens everything, or whether it's a more direct lightning where you actually see the bolt, you see the effects of it. That's what's going on with these dazzling clothes. They're not just bright. They're stunning. And again, that's usually the kind of language that gets employed when we're talking about something divine, such as in the Transfiguration, where in some stories Jesus' face shone like the sun. In other stories, his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than any fuller on earth could ever make them. You know, something like that. It's always a sign of something divine going on there. Okay, so we've got the women and we've got these two men. Any questions about them, their role, their interaction there at the tomb? Yes, ma'am.
At the risk of being obtuse, why would they wait a day, even though it was law? Considering the climate, considering spoilage, considering all things, why would they wait that extra day? Was the law so strong that it superseded all
You got to believe it.
other
Yep.
kinds of reasoning?
Yep.
It was.
They would have done the same with the grandma. They would have done
Well,
the same.
yes, but this is Jesus Christ. This
Yeah.
is not grandma.
Well, they don't know about the Christ part.
Yeah, the Christ part is negotiated
Right.
to this point, but look, these folks are faithful. They're faithful. This is what separates you from the Romans. The Romans don't give a rip what day of the week it is. They work, they make money, they build cities, they conquer. That what makes us Jewish is that God rested on the seventh day. We do that. God commanded it. This is our mark of identity. As much of our mark of identity as anything. And you know, your Jewish friends today, if they're observant Jews, they're always trying to negotiate their way around, you know, how to survive. And, you know, you can make your 6-year-old turn the light on because you're not supposed to, but they haven't been bar mitzvahed yet. So let them do it. There are ways, but the whole purpose of the thing is identity. Remind us who we are. And yes, they took that very, very seriously. But these are poor people. If they could work 7 days a week, they would be better off. And they don't. They don't, because their identity is more important than their prosperity. Imagine that.
Or common sense.
You might call it common
It
sense,
overrides
but if
everything.
you don't know who you are, what good is common sense? You know, I mean, identity is an important thing. Yes, sir.
Well, if it happened to Jesus breaking the law, it could happen to us breaking the law. If they're breaking the law by coming in before the third day, they violated the law and they are ipso facto guilty. So I think that there might have been an element of that there, not selfishly, but realistically,
Right, because I mean, the law plays a certain role of order, right? And once that order breaks down, it's broken. You have to be really careful about that. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder sometimes if we Christians have similar commitments to our identity. Or if part of the challenge of the church is that we are also quick to sacrifice our identity if our money is on the line, if our children's happiness is on the line. I saw parents struggling with Sunday morning baseball games when my kids were little. And my son and 3 others told their coach, we don't play on Sunday morning. So we'd rather forfeit the games than play. And the league changed its policy and quit scheduling games Sunday morning. But the soccer league was made up of a bunch of Latino kids who went to worship on Saturday. Sunday morning was not a problem for these guys. And you couldn't make a dent in the soccer league there. You know, and I wasn't the driver behind it. I just told Mickey, hey, if you don't want to miss Sunday school and church, you just need to tell your coach you won't play, and I'll stand behind you. And whatever happens, happens. And it turned out there were several other kids on the team that felt that way. Often, we struggle with that a little bit because part of our identity as Protestant Christians is we try not to do anything that smacks of legalism. That if you do this, God will love you, right? That's bad theology. And we begin the God loves you, therefore you do this. And frankly, I think we mischaracterize Jews as if they think, oh, if I do this, God will love me. When I think many faithful, observant Jews are saying, God loves us, God calls us, God is with us, therefore we are going to take this seriously. And it becomes a matter of identity.
Are you aware of a line, a cable-like line in the median along the university near the UCI campus?
Yeah.
I am not. Oh, I think I read something.
But there was something in the Register a few days ago about
Right.
it.
I saw the headline. I didn't read it.
It's there with the permission of, I guess, the municipal government. And it marks the boundary of area of a Jewish community. And within that bounds, it gives permission, I think, to a conservative group of Jewish people, permission to relax practices on their Sabbath, such as push a carriage, within the bounds of that line.
Interesting.
They're all over Irvine.
But
They're all over Irvine. You can see.
Are
it.
they?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Mark, yeah.
So there are dispensational spaces
Yeah.
that
Okay.
within which you are
Yeah, they marked the
relieved of
boundaries. though.
certain observances.
I've never
Isn't
seen
that-
that. Where is it? I could see. I don't even know what it happened. That, I just, they
So-
pointed out to me some time ago, so now I'm aware of them, but they mark distances from the places of worship.
Yeah.
Right.
That they're permitted to go.
Yeah, so look, I mean, you look at that and you think, oh, they're cheating. Or they're cutting corners or something. They're not. What they're doing is they're negotiating their particular identities with the world in which we live.
Yeah.
And every faith tradition has been doing that forever. Early Hebrews, the men had several wives. They needed kids. They needed to populate the earth. That had to be a rule because that's the only way you're going to sustain yourself on a sustainable farm or grazing field or something like that. And it was materialistically required. And Marx was not wrong to say that material need has driven the shape of history. It certainly shaped the way marriage and family was understood in the ancient world. By the time you get to the New Testament, it's not that suddenly faithful Jews had this great commitment to monogamous marriage. It's that most of those Jews had moved into a city. And city dwelling, having multiple kids was more of a hazard than it was more of a liability than something good. I mean, this had all happened slowly and bureaucratically and over time. But it was a negotiation that in this context, family means this. Many spouses, many quivers in the arrow, arrows in the quiver, whatever that phrase is. And in some context, faithful family means this. And it wasn't that people were just playing, loose and willy-nilly with either the family structure or the commands of God. It's that we are constantly in this state of negotiation, of trying to understand what it means to be faithful in this context. And so the stakes there are identity. How do we maintain our identity in this context? And at times, your only option is to go live somewhere else. That's why you have these ascetic communities. And at times you kind of have to pay the piper a little bit. That's why you have tax collectors. I just think it's an inescapable part of having a religious identity in a world of difference. And so I think the fact that all four Gospels attest that we're in Jerusalem, we're in the season of Passover. You're not going to play loose with the Sabbath. That's not what you do. That would be a total, almost a total violation of who we are. So I think they waited. In one of the gospel stories, they're checking to see if Jesus is dead, and if he isn't, they're going to break his leg so that he can quit pushing up and breathing and would die quicker, because they wanted to get him down before the Sabbath, because that would be hugely offensive to the Jews if on the Sabbath you're taking their dead Jew down off the cross. So even the Romans are trying to get with it and get this crucifixion over before the Sabbath so they can get him out of the way. So it's huge, and as it should be. Okay, that's a great question, because we talked forever. Yes, ma'am.
Some of us remember the blue laws.
Yeah.
We grew up in the Midwest. And that did help simplify things to stay with and I can remember my grandfather driving us to the beach by Lake Michigan and we passed an ice cream store. And as little kids, my sister and I wanted ice cream. But that we would not stop, because that made somebody work on the Sabbath.
Well, I admire that, because I remember a Sunday when our pastor was going on and on about blue laws in a sermon, and after church we all went out to eat. And even as a kid, I was like, well, somebody got to be working on this, right? Yeah, that's
Oregon had those laws until rather recently. No liquor on Sundays. No,
right.
this is not that far in the past.
No, it's not. And because the issue doesn't go away, we still have identity, and we're negotiating how to maintain our identity in a changing world. That's one reason why I did not join the parents complaining about Sunday morning baseball, is because I saw the duplicity behind the blue law of resistance when I was a child, and I didn't want to be guilty of that thing, because I stopped and get gas on Sundays. I did things that required people not to be in church on Sunday, and believe it or not, the area where we lived had a fairly large growing population of non-Christian believers, either from other traditions or just people who weren't interested at all. And I didn't want to be an impositioner, right? And just say, well, this is what we believe, so now your kid has to live up to it. So it was, it's an ongoing problem. Okay, let's move on just a minute. So the women, they are perplexed. And they're told to remember. This is such a great word. I want us all to love the word remember. It means to reconnect, right? And just anytime you see any member word in the scriptures, please think body parts. If you think body parts, you're thinking scripturally. I say this to all of our new member classes, that we try to have an organic understanding of that term rather than an organizational understanding of that term. And you've heard me say this before, but this will always be my favorite illustration. Ben Franklin writing a letter, and he apologized. Ben Franklin was left-handed. He apologizes for his handwriting because the gout in his large right toe was really bothering him that day. Okay? So he's got swelling in his large right toe. His left hand is quivering or unstable as a result. That's what it means to be members one of another. Paul says the church is the body. And if one member weeps, everybody weeps. If one member rejoices, everybody rejoices. And we are organically connected to one another in that way. Because the other understanding of member, of course, is an organizational one. You join, you quit. You join, you pay your dues, you show up at shareholder meetings once a year. And if you don't like them anymore, you go join something else. Whether it's a club or you're a member of the Gelson's Club and you don't like them anymore, so now you're going over to Whole Foods. You know, we just think it's a matter of come and go, connect, disconnect. Paul saw it very differently. So to leave is a dismemberment. Think about that's one of the few words where we continue to let the word member mean body part. To leave the church is to be dismembered. That's a serious, awful matter in some respect. So to remember now is the opposite of dismember. To remember is to reattach yourself to something to which you belong. That's what we do when we remember. And they remember. The two men in Death and Wife said, remember what he told you. Go back and reconnect to what he said to you back in Galilee. He told you he was going to die. He was going to come back to life. And they remembered. Right then. They became believers right there. Because they remembered what they had been told. I just think it's a marvelous kind of use of that word in this story. So to remember is to reconnect yourself with what's told. And that's almost the opposite of what the men do, right? The women come and tell them what had happened, and they didn't believe them. They didn't believe them. There's a phrase, idle talk, this is the only time that phrase is used in the New Testament. It means silly talk, nonsense, babbling, something like that. The only other instance I can think of when something like this happened, it's in the book of Acts. So perhaps Luke is the one who wrote that story as well. It's when Peter was in prison and the angel came and freed him at night. And he left the prison and he goes to the house where all of the others are and knocks on the door. And a girl named Rhoda, who lives in the house, answers the door. And she goes to the gate, more or less. She sees that it's Peter. And instead of having the wits to let him in, she runs back and tells the other, and they don't believe him. And poor old Peter, he's just banging on the gate, not until they finally go, oh, well, who is that banging on the gate? And it's like, oh, look, it's Peter. So it's a funny thing that there are two different stories of someone telling the truth, and it's good news, and it's so good they're not believing. So the men disbelieve. The word for believe or believing could be trust, or trusting is pistuo. Very, very often appears in the scripture. The verb appears 247 times in the New Testament. That's how important the word is. The noun appears 244 times. So either faith or believe or trust, however you translate it, it could take on various shades of meaning. But it's a huge thing in the gospel, in Paul's letters. It's very important. But this word, disbelief, is the word pistuo with an A at the beginning. That means not believe. A means anti. It only appears 8 times in the scripture. It's not a common thing. And that's the apostles. I mean, I just couldn't get over this while I was making the video. The apostles hear the story of Easter and they don't believe. That's their first response. They don't believe. And I do think there's a male-female dynamic thing going on here that's inescapable. It's absolutely true, and it's embarrassing. But I also just want to say it's the apostles. The 11, these are the ones on whom we're depending, to lead the church. And the first response to the Easter message is they don't believe it. And again, I've asked you to just hold this story, not rush through it, right? So let's just be in that moment for a minute. You're one of the women. You know what you saw, you know what you heard, and you know what you remembered. And you are overjoyed because Jesus told us this would happen, and it has happened. And you go back to tell these folks who were with you back when Jesus told you it would happen. And you expect them to celebrate with you, and they think you're full of baloney. They don't believe you. What does that say about your relationships? What does that say about the way they look at you? What does that say about anything you've ever said to them and they've nodded their head? What does that say about anything you plan to say to them in the future? Right? If you just imagine that moment, it's awkward. I mean, it's hard. And we don't know how long, but eventually one of the men decided to check it out for himself. Right? But imagine if instead of 5 seconds, that's 10 minutes. How awful are those 10 minutes? Yes, ma'am.
Well, to say a little bit in their defense, they have all just recently been traumatized.
Yes.
And how long ago was it that Jesus told them that he would be delivered, crucified? Is that how?
Well,
Not sure.
it was.
I mean,
It's part of the story complex of heading to Jerusalem, and he tells them 3 times. So it's not a lesson they shouldn't have learned. I'm not going to give you
you're
that
not
part,
gonna give me that.
but I will certainly concede the first part.
The women were
These,
traumatized as well.
of course they were, yeah.
Well, it
And
doesn't say whether or not the women believed or didn't believe. The women experienced the, going
right,
to the tomb.
they were perplexed
Yeah,
when they saw the empty tomb, right?
yeah.
But when they heard the word from the 2 men in dazzling attire, it was a little hard to argue with that, I
Right,
suppose. Yeah, there's no question. There's no question in the text about whether they went through a period of how can this be true or can I trust it. So we don't have an instance of the women after hearing the news not believing. They remembered. That's why I want to think remember and disbelieve are in contrast here. They remembered. They were told to remember, and they did. Now, if one of you came up and told me something that's really hard to believe, I would have to labor to believe it, right? I would know that you're not a person prone to lying, and I'd have to take that into account. C.S. Lewis deals with this really well in the Chronicles of Narnia. Because someone told, when they're back in England, one of the kids told another kid about something that happened in Narnia, and they didn't believe it. And later, when they're talking to a wise professor, the professor says, "Does she lie a lot? Do you know that Lucy lies?" Said, "I've never known Lucy to lie. Why do you imagine she's lying now?" "But I can't believe that." "Well, that's on you. Do you know her to be a liar?" It's just a really kind of interesting thing that I wish that professor had walked into the room and kind of had a talk with these guys. But yes, they've been traumatized. That there's no doubt about that. And we will be throughout this season. I think it's important to hold grief as kind of the underlying compulsion on everybody's part. So yes, that is true. I think Joanne.
And this had never happened before. I mean, in defense of the apostles, this had never happened before.
It doesn't happen.
So that's why they were
That's right.
stunned and maybe didn't believe right away.
That's right. And I don't know if I want to be the kind of person that believes something like that just because you tell me. You know what I mean? I mean, if you're in dazzling white, you know, and look like lightning, and you tell me, I'd be like, okay, you got a little more authority than Deborah over there, you know, who could just be having a moment. Who knows? Right?
Just not uncommon.
Not uncommon. Like Fred Sanford said to Lamont, "I've lied before. What's the problem?" Right? Yeah. So yeah, this is. I was trying to imagine. You know, when it comes to a body being raised from the dead, that's not what bodies do. We all know that. And trying to imagine in Jesus' ministry, was there any other moment when Jesus' body did something that bodies don't do? And the answer is yeah. He walked on water. Bodies don't do that. They tend to sink, right? His face turned dazzling white. At least 3 of the apostles saw that in one of the guys. So, and of course, when you take into account the healings and all of those things that were done at Jesus' word or with his touch, then you've been trained a little bit that when God is present, you know, things unbelievable can happen, right? But we still, things unbelievable are called unbelievable because that's our default setting. Bodies don't come back to life. So to believe in the resurrection is a leap of faith. It really is. It's not a simple thing, and it's not something that makes a lot of sense to us. Not the way we know and experience these corporeal bodies, these mortal coils in which we live. Yes, Jerry.
For me, the last year of these studies and reading along, I really liked it because it felt like Jesus was fighting the Romans, fighting the part of society that didn't take care of people, cared about the losers within the society. And I've really enjoyed that. And here, it seems like there's an absolute change. There's no Romans in this. There's no, we're going to change the Roman society, get our freedom, live better. There's none of that in this. It's a huge change for me. I would think if I were walking well back, but behind Jesus for this last months, saying, let's get those dirty buggers. And now, empty tombs, he's risen, whatever that means. What it's just a total change. It almost feels like there's a new person writing from the story that I've been getting for the last year.
Yeah, but bear in mind, I mean, we're reading 12 verses.
Well,
Because
there's more.
look at this. If you look at the side, I mean, first of all, we skipped the crucifixion story, in which Pilate, Herod, soldier, chief priest, in conjunction with Pilate, Herod, and soldier, are all tremendously vilified. So the thing that you've enjoyed about this is happening during the crucifixion story. In Matthew's story, there's an earthquake. The stone is removed. The soldiers report to Pilate, I think it's Pilate, that what had happened, so that they can concoct a story about how the body was stolen by his disciples. So I think I'm pretty sure that's in Matthew's story. That whole recognition is, look, if Jesus is going to walk out of this tomb, this is going to be a problem for the folks who put him to death in the first place. And it's very centered on the story of the Roman Empire there. So Luke doesn't go there here. You're right. In these 12 verses, it's not happening. And it's, I don't know that we're going to see it again until that night in the story of the road to Emmaus. Because on the road to Emmaus, Jesus joins these two travelers and asks them why they're so downcast. And they're like, their first response is interesting. Are you the only person in all of Jerusalem that doesn't know what just happened? So this is not a small thing happening among a few people. And they tell about Jesus, and they describe him this way. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. So those are fighting words, right? That doesn't mean to make our hearts clean. It means to get us out from under this regime, right? So part of the dismay, part of the disappointment is exactly what you're pointing to, Jerry, is that they are really trusted that Jesus was going to show us a way out of this. And Jesus walking the road with those two disciples on the road to Emmaus shows them, going back to the prophets, how what had happened was what was needed in order to redeem Israel. So in Luke's theology, the betrayal, the abandonment, the arrest, the things that Jesus was bound to suffer, and the resurrection are all part of this redemptive event that really has meaning, both religiously and politically. But you're right, in these 12 verses, you don't see it because this is the story of the event itself, not so much the interpretation of it. And I think when you get into the next story, you start to see that a little bit. And if you believe that Luke is the one who wrote the book of Acts, Acts ends with the Apostle Paul holding court in Rome. So that's not a small device, a literary device there. That's a very blatant one. Anyway, but yeah, I hear you. I think it is Matthew's gospel where all of that happens, and I think that one remains more politically. If you looked it up, Les. Is it in Matthew's gospel? Did you happen to look it up?
The earthquake,
Yeah. Okay.
But,
Yes, ma'am.
well, I'm gonna sort of prolong your point a little bit.
All right.
Unless you wanted to move on, given the time, maybe we do.
No,
But,
have at it. It's your time.
But what does the resurrection add to the previous healing and social justice messages that were coming through in other stories? It seems to me that in some respects, it moves the needle more toward, having to go along with sin and personal salvation somehow, which is a line that I have more difficulty with, but,
Right,
rather than the earlier messages of the works that he did. Is that where you were kind of, sort of? I wouldn't
Yeah,
have to
okay.
linger on that, but it's just an interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question.
yeah. So just in case anyone watching online wasn't able to hear Bill, it does seem that the resurrection adds, if you don't mind me saying, kind of a religious component to it that needs believing. I don't know if it doesn't really say anything about sin and salvation. That's just how we've heard it all these years, right? But it does add a component to it that you have to believe that kind of befuddles the imagination. Whereas the other stories are all about liberation. It's all about,
Healing, looking after your neighbor.
yeah, just leaning into what it means to be liberated from the regime and so forth. And so it does feel a little different here, that now for this to work or to be as meaningful, you have to believe in something kind of miraculous. Whereas before, possibly, you could come out with Jesus being both just a very good teacher, not just a very good teacher, a liberator, a revolutionary, and a martyr. You can say all of that up until this point. But now if you say Christ is risen indeed, you're saying something more. And something that really presses you to believe something that's hard to believe. And am I representing that fairly? Yeah. So your question, and the question that it gives to us is, what is the qualitative difference between Jesus risen versus Jesus the martyr? And look, there would be a ton of value in Jesus being the teacher, the example, the healer, the liberator, the revolutionary, and the martyr. There'd be a lot of value in that. That's how I see people like Oscar Romero, Martin Luther King Jr., others who have been martyred for speaking truth to power, right? These are heroes in many respects. I mentioned those two because I was at Westminster Abbey and their statues are next to one another up on the wall there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's the wall of martyrs. But Jesus is more than a martyr. At least to hear the Gospels tell it, at least to hear the church tell it, at least to hear me preach it. Jesus is more than a martyr. Jesus is the risen one. And that's the crux of faith. Right there. And I think a lot of folks are fine up until that point. And then at that point, it's just like, if you see it that way. Let me give you the example of Borg and Cross for just a minute. In their book, The Last Week, which is about the Gospel of Mark, they talk about the differences in all the Easter stories. And their argument, if I'm reading them correctly, their argument is that the resurrection is not necessarily something you have to believe as an historic event. Because the resurrection story, the point of the resurrection story is that the church experienced the presence of Christ. And these resurrection stories are their ways of trying to proclaim their experience of the resurrected Christ. Now, see, you put it in those terms, then you don't really have to have a body per se. You don't really have to have, kind of thinking past our normal way of thinking, because of the nebulousness of the word spirit, right? You can have the spirit of Dr. King here in this room as we all aspire to fight injustice. And that's how they kind of reckon with, on the one hand, the idea that corporeal bodies do die and don't get resurrected. And on the other hand, that this is the Christian message. So in many ways, they spiritualize it, to be sure. And I think they make a very strong argument. I would say that their argument is strengthened by the fact that Jesus' body in all of these resurrection stories is weird. I mean, he appears in a room where the door is locked. Like, what, see Casper? All of a sudden, he's kind of go through walls. Does he not have corporeality like we know it? Well, on the other hand, he eats. If he were Casper, you'd see the food. He wouldn't be able to hold anything because his fingers would go right through the fish, right? He cooks. He tells someone, don't hold on to him. So her arms didn't go through him, right? He's not Casper. So in one story, it seems like Jesus isn't bound by the laws of physics. Yeah. And the other story, he is. And I'm not saying that to doubt one story or that. I'm saying that even among the early church, it was hard to pinpoint exactly what the risen Christ was and what it means to be in the presence of the risen Christ. But one thing none of them doubts is that they were in the presence of the risen Christ. And I think that's what Borg and Crossan are trying to pick up on, is the given in all four accounts, plus the book of Acts, is that Jesus Christ was really present with them. And the reason they make that argument is because Jesus Christ is really present with you too. This is not a history book. It's the book about life, true life. And so in that sense, maybe our experience of the Christ is not as terribly different from those first disciples as we thought, which again is why I want to say it's so genuine that they struggle to believe, even though they have trusted eyewitnesses, even though they're in the presence of Jesus. It's hard to believe. Dazzling disbelief. Peter running to the tomb, marveled, right? That doesn't quite say that he believed, but he marveled. It's the same reaction in the birth story. People marveled at what was told to them by the shepherd. So anyway, it is well past 10:30. I have an 11 o'clock Zoom call, and it is Holy Week. So we're going to call it right here. And this is our last time together. So let me end with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we believe. Help us in our unbelief. Empower us by the presence of Christ through these few days of reckoning with the reality of sin and pain. In the name of the one whose death and resurrection brings us new life. Amen. All right. Thank you, everybody. Suzanne, you can stop the recording now.
Thank you.